Good afternoon. Hope everyone's doing well. Hope you've been absorbing nearly 2 days now of panels and sessions. We've got a few more here, and I'll be honest. I've been excited about this one. My confession to make is that I'm a fairly boring nerd, and so RPA really appeals to me in a lot of ways. I'm also from the Midwest. I've lived in the Midwest almost my entire life, and the solutions that RPA brings are really important to that part of the country. We'll get to that in just a little bit. This market is enormous, right? And it's growing really fast. That's a $2 billion number. Just a short time ago, it was a $1 billion number. I think Gartner predicted $1 billion total addressable market by 2020, which is in a few months. But it sounds like we're far past that, right? So just to kind of get a baseline here, we've been talking about a lot of business concerns and a lot of tech concerns, but you guys are actually putting up the money. So just from an investor perspective, just give me your take on where the market is now compared to a year ago and maybe compared to a year from now.
I'm Lan, by the way. I go by Lan Xuezhao. It's my last name. Sorry, my first name actually, but it's easier. So I run a fund called Basis Set Ventures. We invest in automation and AI, so that's all we've been investing. Been around for about 2 years. It's super clear that this is growing super fast. I think it's not comparing this year versus last year. I think maybe 5 years versus 5 years ago, like a very big fundamental shift in terms of automation. It only happens more and more often this year and last year. Virtually all the companies we're investing in have some sort of automation angle. Anything from office workflow automation to factory automation, farming. We have a company in the Midwest, automating the factory setting. So I think it's very, very obvious is it's starting from the areas people are familiar with, office worker, automation, workflow, to-do list, to tripling down to other industries, more of the slow-moving legacy industries like construction, farming, factory. Even those industries are starting to automate and happening very fast.
So before I get into that, just a little bit of background. So my name is Chahal. I'm a partner at Lightspeed Venture Partners. We've been around for about 20 years. We manage total about $7 to $8 billion under management. And over those 20 years, we've seen the progression of the notion of automation and technology applied to different sort of businesses in different sort of ways. And what we're seeing now is the first generation of automation has sort of played through. And the first generation of automation was largely around automation technology, so scripts and other things that are automating technical pieces. So might be automating your data center, might be automating your software development and so on. And that is still progressing and it's continued to evolve. What we are seeing with RPA is now suddenly some technical components available today that were not available 4 or 5 years ago that make it possible to automate things that were deemed largely not automatable 5 years ago, right? So if 5 years ago, or let's make it even cleaner, let's say 10 years ago, if I said, let's automate our ability to look at these set of pictures and categorize them in some way, you can do that. Right? You wanted to do that. There's always a need for automation, for speed reasons primarily, but also for cost reasons. But today, there are some fundamental building blocks in computer vision, in NLP understanding, in overall machine learning and deep learning and other pieces of technology that make a much larger pool of things automatable. And I think the big change, your question was what has changed in the last year or so. I agree with Lan that you have to go back maybe a couple of years more or so, but the big change is then it was theory, and now the proof points are there, right? These companies are not just raising tons of money, they're making tons of money, right? So these companies are not just saying, hey, I've got $1 billion valuation. They're closing deals with tens of millions of dollars. They're making money which is in the 50, 100 or more $1 million a year. So I think that's sort of the big thing that is past the lab sort of stage and going into production in a big way. And businesses are seeing value, and so they're doubling down. And so the market just continues to grow faster than anyone expected because it's just sort of everybody's continuing to double down on their investments in RPA.
Yeah, and one of the things that we discussed a little bit, and I'm interested in sort of more specific take on it, is structurally, this is a familiar pattern, right? Where we start solving almost bespoke problems, very specific problems where maybe there's not a huge amount of money, but you have to solve those to get to the bigger, broader solutions where kind of the bigger and bigger and bigger money is, right? Where are we kind of in that cycle, do you think, in terms of, we're solving small problems, now we're solving more broad problems, and at some point it would be extremely broad, right?
So I'd say if you look at it as sort of a three-stage process, we're sort of entering stage 2. And the way I would define those 3 stages are, the first stage is where RPA has been, and those are the big names that we hear about right now. And those companies were all about, let's take a bunch of really smart people who are going to work with the business, understand which processes can be automated, and then apply really interesting technology to automating those processes. And that's continuing to play out. That's where a lot of people are making just a ton of revenue right now. And that's the current generation. Where we are focused now as investors is sort of the next generation, which is even that first part of what to automate, that can we automate that in of itself so that the entire pipeline becomes really, really simple. As a business, I can reach out to software that can tell me what to automate, when, and then go ahead and automate it for me so that there's much broader penetration, much faster penetration of these technology. And stage 3 is what you're talking about, which is like this really broad, almost AI that's almost running all of the back office for you. I think we're a little bit farther away from that right now, but we're still sort of at this cusp of the first generation of RPA technologies sort of still gaining considerable momentum, but this next generation coming up right behind, which can automate much faster to a much higher degree with much less human participation involved, tons of consultants and so on.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think you always start from a smaller problem and then grows kind of solving that. It's not necessarily a small market, like small pinpoint, big pinpoint, like kind of bounded, and then you grow. I think there are 2 ways companies we see companies grow. One is, as Guru mentioned, more automatic. Initially, you probably have to set up the process. This is what you automate. Once you set this up, this can run every day without having to touch it. In the future, the machine can tell you what process you're actually automating, so that becomes more and more horizontal and faster. Another direction we're seeing is full stack. So, instead of solving one problem, you actually build a robot that just solve like literally bottom stack to top stack everything and completely replacing human. That also happens. So both dimensions, things are happening pretty fast and iterating very rapidly.
Yeah, I agree with it. That's a really interesting observation because we're also watching this movement where people really like what the current generation of automation or RPA can do, let's say mid-pipeline. So you've got humans in the middle deciding what to automate, then you automate, and then there's humans on the back end trying to figure out if this is working well. Yeah. And so we're beginning to see these next generation of companies coming up, some of which we are investing in, where they can automate this entire pipeline. What to automate, how to automate, and then watch it carefully to make sure it's aligned with your priorities from a policy perspective, and it's working as intended and so on.
Sure. So I want to get into the topic of geography. We've talked a bit about this, and to me that's one of the most interesting things about this. And I don't want to get the percentage wrong. Milan, you told me a percentage of investment dollars outside of Silicon Valley in RPA. It's a staggering number. Do you remember off the top of your head?
I don't think that's an aggregate number. It's one top firm that I talked to. They were saying over time, they start to make more investments outside of the Bay Area. This is a growth stage fund. Today, they're seeing 80% of their investment outside of the Bay Area for their growth stage fund, which was like pretty shocking to me. Most of the time, it's flipped, right? 80% in the Bay Area and 20% outside, but the number is actually completely reversed, not what I was expecting.
Yeah, and as a practical matter for you, like you're traveling a lot. It's just suddenly like you're in planes, trains, and automobiles going all of the places that I think you mentioned, like Georgia and Ohio and Toronto and all these different locations. How has that presented a challenge for you, just in figuring out where to put your money?
It's actually super exciting. It's more, obviously there are challenges. I think it opens up so many opportunities. California, most of our deal flows still come from California, but in other regions like Midwest, South, and even Canada, They're just new ideas and kind of new industries that's never been touched. Like for example, when we talk about factory automation, right? There's not a lot of factory in California. When entrepreneurs want to start a company, they need to find clients to iterate and build their product. Where are the natural places to go? Midwest is one of the places where it's just perfect for them to start a company. So we have a company in Ohio that does welding robot. Ohio alone, for welding, $6 billion market, super huge. So that's really natural, and we're very excited to fund companies that's close to their market, close to the customer, have the talent and can kind of support a really strong and big company. Similarly, in Atlanta, for example, there are a lot of enterprise automation company, logistics, supply chain, super big in those regions. So we're finding these pockets of opportunities across the country in North America to invest in. I think that happens more and more often. Also, like there's price advantage, there's talent advantage, there's a lot of other advantages that we're just not seeing in the Bay Area.
I agree. I mean, talent is increasingly a global resource, and we saw the movement of this. We saw this sort of movement, several years ago, almost a decade ago, certainly in enterprise IT, and now increasingly in various non-traditional IT industries as well. And so, from scratch, we had always had this notion that we need to be able to support entrepreneurs and businesses almost anywhere. So our partnership is built as a global platform with, fairly large offices, certainly here in California. We have offices out of Israel, we have offices out of India, and partners out of India and partners out of China. And what that allows us to do is when companies, identify companies across various geographies, but not just invest in them, when they're ready to scale, help them scale not just in the local market, but also scale more broadly in a global market, and be able to connect them with partners and offices and contacts and networks all over the world, wherever they might want to expand into. Mm-hmm. So yeah, we see the same thing. Now I'm not going to suggest that was a surprisingly large number, 80% outside of the Valley. So I'm not going to suggest we see the same thing. I think a lot of the innovation is still coming from these very, very concentrated hubs. Silicon Valley continues to drive just an insane amount of not just automation, but innovation in general. New York is a big hub. London is a big hub. Berlin is an emerging hub, as Lan and I both agree. Israel is a huge hub, and then India and China, especially in ML and AI. So a lot of the automation, next generation of automation companies, we're looking at both China and India to source a lot of that innovation as well.
Yeah, the other trend we're seeing, you mentioned this a little bit, is teams getting distributed. I worked at Dropbox about 5 years ago when I was doing M&A at Dropbox. We wouldn't if you have a remote team, that's really, really rare. We're doing acquisitions, most of the companies we're seeing actually are based in San Francisco and very concentrated in San Francisco. 5 years later today, almost every single one of our portfolio companies are thinking about hiring remote teams and distribute how to run that.
That's right.
I'm hearing that more and more often. Every single company almost have at least thought about that in some ways. Yeah. And we have companies running completely distributed and remote teams, 50 people. One of our companies have 50 people all distributed.
Yeah, this is something I went through even personally as well. So I started a company several years ago that VMware purchased actually fairly recently. And I was telling the statistics to someone, 90% of my team was remote. And the reason for that was I had a high priority as a manager, as a founder, as a product executive. You want to find the best people you can. And so when you would put out a job rec, it was amazing the kind of talent you were able to source in Milwaukee, in Chicago, in LA, in San Diego, in RTP in North Carolina, or worldwide out in a small town in Germany, or a tier 2 or even a tier 3 city out in India. And you want to set up processes in place that you're able to attract that talent. So we were able to do that too. And some of that is because the tooling has improved a lot. And some of that is because really that there's more and more talent available in those geos.
So I'm going to ask you a question. I'm going to give you some context for the question about sustainability. And I mean sustainability of businesses. And so for the context, there's a John McGilligan sighting. So he runs York Exponential in York, Pennsylvania. We just had our Blueprint event just a couple months ago with those guys out there. So we were in York. We had the whole event there. And one of the big things that they talk about, and it's sort of is counterintuitive to what happens in Silicon Valley a lot, is the idea of a 100-year business. right? So many of these legacy industries, they're old companies, 50 years, 100 years. And so one of the things that's come up, and they talked about, investing across, the heartland is sort of a general term, but all across the country outside of some of those hubs, is, you have a remote team. It's 50 people in an office in Milwaukee, but how sustainable is that? Can they count on those 50 jobs being there, and for how long? And will it turn into 100 jobs or 1,000 jobs? There's sort of the concern that I think a lot of people have when we start talking about, being outside of some of these hubs.
It's always useful to start from the data, and the data is, the reality of the market today is unemployment is at a historical low, and the need, if you look at the job recs just within the technology industry, is just massive. And so my thesis would be not only are those sustainable, but as long as you can continue to find the talent, that local office will suck out all the talent in that market. I think it's got more to do with whether the company is successful or not. I don't think the geo. I suspect it's the opposite, which is, can you make 1 or 2 people successful, which is a much harder problem than trying to make 10, 50, or 100 people successful. And this I can tell you from personal experience. Much easier to run a 50% office remote than a 2% office remote, because it's just much harder to make them feel part of the team, be connected with them, and so on. But if there's 50 people there, they're talking at the water cooler, they're walking around, grabbing a coffee, we need sort of a little bit of a human touch as well. So I'd say it's a reverse, which is that seed is hard. When the seed takes off, boy, it's at that point, the easiest thing to do is just continue to add more.
Yeah, I think there are more and more hubs popping up in different parts of the world. Some are converging into kind of a local hub and spot model.
Yeah.
I went to Detroit last year. I couldn't believe so I spent 4 years in Mission. My husband grew up in Detroit. I just couldn't believe what I was seeing last year. It's very highly concentrated hub with lots of great talents, lots of great coffee, single origin coffee, and it looks very much like Silicon Valley without the price, is what I was seeing. I think they're seeing that a lot more often across the country and getting just bigger and bigger. With dual security exiting, there are going to be more and more talent and more jobs in those regions. I think it will stabilize across the country with different hubs and kind of different hub spokes. But we're converging locally. A lot of the talents are going to Atlanta, for example, right, and Detroit. I think that it feels like that's happening.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is speaking to sort of the longevity of some of these businesses. And I don't know if maybe you guys haven't encountered this so much on your end of things, but these technologies are helping legacy businesses. Do you have any unique experiences working with a company that has a 100-year, 50-year legacy versus working with a startup that needs something right now that's very, very hot and exciting?
Yeah, we invest in farming, technology, and factory automation, right? The farms have been around for a long time. People's belief in the past is it's very hard to sell into farms. Completely not true. If you talk to farmers, their pain points are so strong. They can't find people to do their work. So there's a massive amount of labor shortage. They're very open and desperate for technology solution. Actually, it's very fast to sell into farms right now, if you have something works. So we have a company that does automation for weeding. Their sales cycle is three meetings and you sell, which is much shorter than your typical tech companies. So that's happening. That's one trend. The other trend is we're seeing more companies doing indoor farming and bringing it closer to home and completely replacing those industry. Obviously, that's much harder because it's much more capital intense. You want to build a farming house, you're going to need hundreds of millions of dollars versus you build a robot to let the farmer use. It's simpler solution, and they're desperate for that. Similar things we're seeing in factory automation, construction, all those industries. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd agree with that observation. The hunger today for absorbing technology in a traditional non-technology vertical is more so than ever. I mean, we've invested across the sector, from farming to robotics to drones, for instance. We invested in this company that does drones that primarily sells into mining. And I know several executives in the mining industry, and they were the first ones to admit traditionally it was not the place where you went to sell technology. It was really, really hard, took a long time. Safety is the primary concern. And yet for this company, they just keep closing deals over and over again, one of the fastest closing cycles. So I think in general, almost every vertical has realized that a few verticals have had almost this disproportionate access to technology, and they've done really, really well, whether it's in banking or technology or retail or to some extent even healthcare and others. And whereas other verticals like farming or mining or factories in general have not quite seen the same benefit. And so now there's this massive hunger at the top with the CEOs going, what's going on? Like we need to adopt more technology.
Yeah. It's a fascinating subject. I would love to continue talking about it. We have some time for a couple of questions, if anyone has a question. I see one in the back. Do we have a mic floating?
We don't. You're going to have to shout out. I'm sorry. We lost our mic.
Yeah, no worries. I was just curious, if you were given a choice of having to pick between investing in verticals versus horizontal, I know it's an unfair question, but which would you pick and why?
So the question is, would you want to invest in a vertical or horizontal, essentially?
Yeah, it's a great question, something we talk about a lot, and the answer is both. You have to invest, and both not in a either or sense, but only invest in things that can do both. And what I mean by that is the largest companies historically, including in the RPA space or automation or any technology space, which is a space I know well, the largest companies today, which are all platforms, right? They're all platforms, but they didn't. If you look back, they didn't start as platforms. So you have to, as an investor, what we're looking for are essentially founders at the earliest stages who've got that mentality that I want to build a platform, but they also realize that you can't sell platforms. Customers don't buy platforms. Customers buy a solution for a pain point that they have. And the ideal situation is they buy that solution, and without even realizing what that pulls in is this massive platform that has tremendous value to them over an extended period of time. So you can have expansion within the account and so on. So we're always looking for not point solutions. I mean, listen, we manage billions of dollars. We are looking for outcomes that are $5 billion, $10 billion, $50 billion public companies 5, 10, 15 years down the pike. Those are not going to be a single, those companies have almost by definition, they have to be Swiss knives. But you have to, even if you're building a Swiss knife, you have to decide which tool to build first. And if that sells, you'll have more cash to build the rest of the tools. So that's how we view the market.
I'm going to reframe your question a little bit, and then tell you that we're investing fast-growing, high-margin software business. Sometimes that's vertical, sometimes that's horizontal. The reason is that sometimes the point solution is not that useful. You have to capture up and down the supply chain to have much higher margin and growing faster in a certain vertical. So that becomes a more valuable business. Sometimes when you have Dropbox, you actually have 90% margin to sell to every single company on earth. Why don't you do that? But that's much harder to have a business that's just so scalable, so viral. So I mean, so that's kind of the, I guess it depends.
Yeah, if you'd like, I can give a very quick sort of real example, because hypothetically all these, because when an investor answers the question, hypothetically it sounds really good, but like where's the meat sometimes?
Yeah, so what
let me
exactly?
give you a real example of this. So we invested in a company last year called Fortress IQ. It's in the RPA space, and they were solving a very specific problem, right? And the problem was, you as a company want to do RPA, a bunch of consultants show up, watch your people do their thing, and they study them, and they say, okay, this process we should go. But that's fraught with problems. It's very expensive. You only get a view into one tiny part of what the employee is doing, and you automate that, but you might have missed all these corner cases. Mm-hmm. So they said, we're going to solve this problem. We're going to have computer vision, and that's going to record how the employee goes through the day and what tasks they're doing, especially in sort of a desktop worker context. And then we'll be able to have very discrete and accurate and full data on what to automate, when and how, and what the corner cases are, and so on. And so it's amazing what the product can do. Now that sounds like a point product, because you're not quite RPA, you're pre-RPA, helping people do RPA. But the question is, when you capture that, is the team able to build the product in a way that's a platform that can then help you not just decide what to automate, but also then subsequently automate it, and then track how the robots are actually doing their task. And so you gotta take a step back and take what's the immediate problem you're solving, the pain point, and then say, how does that help you insert a platform into that can then grab additional market share? So that's a real example of how we think about this.
Great.
Okay, one more question.
Yeah.
So I have a two-part question. The first question is that when you are RPA, you are replacing humans.
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily.
Yeah, not necessarily. But yes, sometimes.
Sure.
There is a human element, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So what have you seen as some of the best scenarios where somebody presented you a case where humans are being replaced, but there was some study where, like, what was the benefit that was cited? That's one. Secondly, what are the pricing models for how to price a robot to a task
That's a great question. We're not going to have time to answer it as fully as it deserves. But so essentially then the question is, what about the human problem, right? Are we replacing humans? Are we augmenting humans? And what is the cost of bringing the automation to replace the human labor? I think that's essentially the question.
So there are 4 things we look for when we think about like replacing or assisting humans. What problems we're solving essentially. 1, or democratizing access. Sometimes one, something that are too expensive, not anybody can use it. With technology, you can allow more people to use it, right? So that's one thing that technology can, automation can solve that without it you can't. In the process, you're actually not replacing human, you're assisting human to do better, therefore opening up to more people. Second one is solving labor shortage issues. As I mentioned, sometimes you replace human completely. Sometimes you're just assisting human to do better and faster and cheaper. So that you can, actually, there are things that sometimes humans don't want to do, and you're just using machine to do. Like farming and factory, there are jobs that humans just won't do, right? You're not replacing, you're actually just literally filling the blank. And then there's augmenting human potential. There are sometimes human can't even do the thing. With machine learning, you can do drug discovery. That's just much beyond the human potential that you can do with automation as well. And finally, increasing ROI. Like what is the ROI you're using with automation versus not? Sometimes you're using less human. You're not replacing completely. You're using less the time, but you're still like getting the job done just like cheaper. So these are the 4 kind of pinpoints I'm seeing the market, and then we're kind of invest along the lines.
I can't add to that.
That sounds like a great way.
Anything I add to that, it just takes the bar down. Like there's no point.
So it's a perfect way to end then. Guru and Lan, thank you so much for
Thank
your
you.
wisdom and insight. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.